Much. It's a pleasure to be here, to be part of this wonderful community effort. And as we will soon see, that's an important theme of Shabbat is bringing everyone together. Reunion, I think, is a big word that we could use in terms of Shabbat. So we'll get into that soon. But first, I want to begin with there's a passage from the Talmud that says the following, that God says to Moses, God says, I have a precious gift in my treasure house, and it's called Shabbat, and I want to give it to the Jewish people. Go tell them. In other words, this is not just a mitzvah like any other mitzvah, but God refers to the mitzvah of Shabbat as a gift. Why the analogy of a gift? So, of course, there's always a lot of commentary on everything, but one of the answers given is that, when you buy something, you really typically check it out before you buy it. You have some idea of what it is that you're buying. But when you receive a gift, what happens with a gift is that you don't really know much about it beforehand because you didn't research it. And then you get the gift. And then, of course, it's up to you to figure out how wonderful this gift really is. You start to unwrap the gift. And so it is with Shabbos or Shabbat. And the idea of Shabbos is that it's a gift that you unwrap. And there are layers and layers of understanding and appreciating the beauty and the wonder of Shabbos. So let's get going. Let's start to unwrap a little bit of what is the gift of Shabbos. So of course, Shabbos is referred to as a day of rest. And let's understand, so what's the benefit? What is not just the benefit, but what's so special about having a day of rest? So I guess in very simple terms, it's simply an idea of that you can't be a machine that works and works and works. At some point, you have to be able to stop because otherwise there'll be exhaustion, there'll be burnout. So clearly, the idea of having a day of rest just simply makes a lot of sense. It's a very logical idea because your work will be a lot better if you have an ability to rest. Okay, so that's number one. I guess number two, to take that a little further, is that the idea of Shabbos or a day of rest is to remind us that we are more than our jobs. In other words, it's not that I am an accountant who happens to be a human being, but I'm a human being who happens to be an accountant. In other words, to make sure that we get our priorities right. We live in a world where success is, of course, a big thing, and we all want to succeed. And sometimes in the rush to succeed and the ambition to succeed sometimes takes us away from the things that are maybe really important in life. And so we have the day of Shabbos, that day of rest, to kind of refocus, to understand who we really are. And therefore, it's a time to be more with the family, especially if you think of the Shabbos meals. What's so special about the Shabbos meal is that besides the fact that the food is extra delicious, there's always more food, there's always more courses. And the idea is that you're not rushing through the meal because you've got an appointment or you got to run somewhere, you got to, catch the store before it closes. When you sit at a Shabbos meal, you linger with your family, you spend time, because that's the whole idea. It's really a time of recognizing how important our family is to us, and not just family, but it's a time when we can meet up with friends, when we go to shul, when we go to synagogue, we meet up with the community again. In other words, Shabbos is very much a day of reunion. So during the week, we're out there trying to fix the world and make a living and all the other good things that we're trying to accomplish. Shabbos is that day of kind of coming home, that reunion with our community, with our family, with our friends, and actually with ourselves as well. It's a time when we can do the things that we don't have time to do during the week. And as Jews, a good part of that is to spend some time doing a little bit more Torah study, a little bit more time in prayer. So that's very, very simply how we would refer to Shabbos as being a day that is so beneficial. And it's a gift. We unwrap the gift and we say, wow, this is so wonderful. It does so much for us. Okay. However, there has to be more, because we've got to unwrap this a bit more, because the truth is, if Shabbos was simply designed to be a day of rest from work and a day to spend with the family, then why not have Shabbos turn into a family trip day? Why not celebrate Shabbos, every Shabbos you should go on a family trip and spend time as a family on a trip. But that's not the way we spend Shabbos. We're home. Also, why is Shabbos every seventh day? Why is it so specific? I mean, if it's a question of just every once in a while taking a break and spending time with family and with friends, why does it have to be every seventh day? So clearly there has to be more to Shabbos than just these human benefits that we've pointed out. Plus, when we refer to Shabbos or Shabbat, by the way, I'm going to use the word Shabbos probably more than Shabbat, but it's the same thing. It's called a variation on a theme. At any rate, so when we refer to Shabbos, interestingly, we call it Shabbos Kodesh, Shabbat Kodesh, the holy Sabbath. So by saying that it's a day of holiness, what's that? That is telling us that it's far more than just a day of resting from work in order to work more, or a day of just simply being with family and friends. That there's an element of sanctity, there's an element of holiness. There's something about Shabbos that speaks to our spirituality, and this is really where I want to go deeper. In fact, when we say the Kiddush on Shabbos, we quote from the Torah that talks about how God sanctified the seventh day. Vayikadesh oto, God sanctified. So the idea of sanctifying, the idea of holiness, let's understand a little bit more what we mean by the holiness of the Shabbos beyond the human benefits of the Shabbos. So let's take a look in the Ten Commandments where Shabbos is given to us. And there God tells us the following, that we have to work for 7 days and rest on the seventh. We work for 6 days and rest on the seventh. Why? Because God did the same thing. God worked for 6 days and God rested on the seventh. So very simply, what that tells us then is that Shabbos is a day that reminds us. It reminds us that the world that we live in, and the world in which we are functioning, and the world with which we are not just interacting, but a world that we are fixing, a world that we are improving, and we're accomplishing so much in our lives. All of that, there needs to be a day to say, wait a minute, what is this really all about? The work that I put into succeeding, is there a higher goal to all of this? And Shabbos does that. Shabbos is like the rudder of the week. Shabbos it kind of sets the tone. It reminds us, wait a minute, this world that I'm living in is a world that it didn't create itself. It wasn't always here. There was a point when the world did not exist. God creates the world. And in fact, that's what Shabbos is, a reminder of creation. Just like God creates the world in 6 days and rests on the seventh, so too, we are creative during the 6 days of the week, and we rest on the seventh. And it reminds us that if God creates the world, then God has created the world for a purpose. And Shabbos is that day when we remind ourselves of that. Sometimes, human nature is such that you work and you succeed, and it's very easy to, if thank God we are successful, it's very easy to get kind of carried away with our own success and say, wow, and to forget really why are we doing this? And so Shabbos reminds us that we're doing this because God wants a good world. He wants us to function in his world and make his world into a better place. So this is the one day of the week when we kind of stop, take stock, and ask ourselves, what is this all about? What is the purpose? What is the focus? And then we can go back again into the week and be re-energized by the focus of Shabbos, and realize that whatever it is that we're doing out there, it's not just for ourselves in terms of furthering our own personal agenda, but there's a higher agenda, there's a godly agenda, there's the divine mission of fixing the world. So Shabbos serves that purpose. It reminds us of creation. But here comes the big question. Okay, so what did we just say? We said that God worked, so to speak, for 6 days, and then God rests on the seventh. And we work for 6 days and we rest on the seventh. But the big question is, what does it mean that God works and then he rests? Now, for us as human beings, we work hard. And so there's the idea, after you work hard, you need a rest. You sit down on the couch and you relax. But What does this mean for God? Did God huff and puff for 6 days and then kind of flop down into some divine cosmic couch and say, phew, thank God it's Shabbos, I'm really exhausted? I mean, obviously, that's not what happens, okay? So, because God is creating, God is not huffing and puffing, God is infinite, and clearly for God to create the world doesn't involve any kind of effort and schlepping the way we think of effort and schlepping. And so, by the way, you know, certainly this understanding that for God to create the world does not involve effort and hard work, you know, and like I said, that's obvious to us. That, by the way, just on a side tangent, gives us a little bit of an understanding that when the Torah tells us not to work on Shabbos, people think that the definition of work is something that is hard to do, you know, something that involves sweating and schlepping things. You know, that's the kind of work from which we have to rest on Shabbos. But if it's a matter of pushing a button, which involves little effort, that seems to be perfectly fine. So now that we understand that if we refrain from work because God refrains from his work of creating the world, well, God's work in creating the world wasn't effort, the way we think of effort. Nevertheless, it was creative. So God is resting from being creative, and therefore we have to rest from being creative, even though the creativity could be very simple and without any toil, without any schlepping. Nevertheless, just like God rests from something that doesn't necessarily involve effort, so too we have to rest even though it doesn't necessarily involve effort. Okay, but I want to come back to the question, but we still need to understand, so what does it mean to rest? What does it mean that God is creating and then God is resting? How does that work? Okay, so we need to unwrap this. We need to unwrap this a bit more. So let's take this a little further. So in Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism, it talks about the creation of the world. Now, according to our calendar, we're in the year 5781, which according to our tradition, that's when creation began. God said, I want a world, and so God created the world. So Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, explains at great length that creation is not a one-time thing. In other words, it's not that God created the world in the past tense, and now the world is somehow here because it's being created and the world is functioning on its own. That's not what it means. Kabbalah explains like this, that creation is actually an ongoing process. Creation is happening the whole time. And let me explain how this works. And there's a certain logic to this. Hasidic philosophy takes this idea and explains it and uses the following analogy. You know, when we do something to something else, unnatural, to make that unnatural thing happen, the force that makes it happen has to be constant. Let me translate that into English. Let's say you take a stone. Okay, now a stone does not have a natural ability to fly, but you make that stone fly. How? You throw the stone. So you are making something unnatural happen to that stone. But the stone will only fly as long as the force of your throw is constantly moving it. As soon as the force of your throw stops, the stone will revert back to its original state, which is to not fly. And it'll just come back on the ground and sit there again. Or to maybe a more modern analogy, you've got an electric clock, okay? So the electric clock is made up of plastic and metal, and it has no ability to move. But then you plug it into the socket, the electricity makes the clock move. But the electricity makes the clock move as long as the electricity flows into the clock. As soon as the electricity stops, the clock stops moving. Why is that? Because the clock, that plastic and metal, doesn't have its own ability to move. You can make it move, but if you make it move, then the force that makes it move has to be a constant force that is making it move. As soon as you pull the plug, it stops to move because it reverts back to its natural state. Okay, so now let's apply this to creation. So before the world was created, it did not exist, which means then, another way of saying it, is that the world does not have an inherent ability to exist. If it was natural for the world to exist, it always would have existed. Clearly, the world being here is an unnatural state, because before God created the world, it didn't exist. So the world needs to be brought into existence. And the force, the divine energy that brings the world into existence has to be a constant flow of divine energy that keeps it in existence. You follow? By the way, if someone wants to raise a hand and ask a question at some point, by all means. So at any rate, let me just kind of go back on this for a second.
Or you can add it in the chat box and I'll make sure you.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. All right, fine. Yeah, that works. Okay, so this is called constant creation. In other words, when God creates the world, he puts his divine energy into the world. So let's talk about the table that I'm sitting at. This table does not have a natural ability to exist. At some point, this table did not exist. Even I'm talking about the raw materials of this table. So the fact that it now exists, it's quote unnatural, which means that when God brings the table or the wood or the metal into existence, God is constantly making it exist. So if you go back to the clock analogy, it's not a perfect analogy because the electricity doesn't create the clock. The electricity simply makes the clock move. When you stop the electricity, the clock itself will be there. It just won't move anymore. But when God puts his energy into creation, so it's not just that if God stopped the energy, we would all freeze and stop moving. We would simply cease to exist. So when something is existing, it is existing by the virtue that God is putting his divine energy into that particular thing, keeping it in existence. Now, this concept, it's a big concept, and obviously I'm not spending hours on it, but I'm introducing the concept to you. And this concept, by the way, plays out in other facets of what we believe in terms of the relationship of God and the world. Because now that we establish that God is constantly creating the world, the divine energy that God puts into the world is constantly there. If that's the case, then God is constantly involved with the world. The world is not functioning on its own. I mean, that plays out into the concept known as divine providence, where God is involved in everything. Nothing happens by itself, because nothing can happen by itself, because everything that is there is being brought into existence at this very moment by God, which means that God is connected with everything. And if God is connected with everything, then everything that is happening is all within the purview of God. It's all happening with God. So everything that is happening isn't happening randomly, but rather everything that is happening because it's all connecting with God. That's the concept known as divine providence. But I want to focus now on this idea of constant creation. So basically what we're establishing then is that God is constantly creating the world. And as soon as God stops to create the world simply would cease to exist. Now, this, of course, raises the big question. So what about Shabbos? Now that we've established that for the world to exist, God has to be constantly creating the world. So now the big question is, how does the world exist on Shabbos? If we say that God created for 6 days and then stops creating on Shabbos, then if God is stopping to create on Shabbos, how does the world continue to exist? We just said that the world cannot exist on its own. There has to be the divine energy. So how does the world exist on Shabbos? This is the question that the great Kabbalists ask. And so let's get into this a little bit more. If you go back to the story of creation, so when it says that God creates the world, you look at the narrative in Bereshis, in Genesis, so there it doesn't say God made this. It's more about God saying, let there be light, and there was light. You'll notice that the creation came about through what we refer to as the speech of God. In other words, God said, and by God saying, this is what creates the world. Now, why use the metaphor of speech? So the Kabbalists explain that in using the metaphor of speech, what the Torah is conveying to us is the following. And that is that when you speak, when I speak, right now I'm speaking. Why am I speaking? Because I'm communicating with you. In other words, my speech is a form of communication. Now, when I speak to you, you already exist, and my speaking to you is me communicating with you, okay? But recognize that speech means that I'm, in a sense, going outside of myself. I'm kind of going beyond the me within the me, and I'm now communicating and recognizing that there is an other. That's really what speech is all about. It's a form of communication that goes outside of me and comes to the one with whom I'm communicating. So when we say that God speaks to creation, with God, though, it's not that creation exists and now God is speaking to it, but rather God's speaking to creation is what creates it. In other words, the communication is what creates the world. With me and you already exist before I communicate with you. But when God communicates with us, when God communicates with creation, the communication itself is the divine energy that actually creates us. And that's why when we refer to the word of God being within creation, the word of God is this metaphor for God speaking to, and by speaking to creation, God actually creating the world. Okay, so again, it's a form of communication. Speech is God creating and communicating with the world. Okay, now, then there's actually another form of communication, which is thought. Thought is actually a more internal communication. In other words, when I'm thinking, I'm not really going so much outside of myself, but rather I'm communicating more within myself. The difference between thought and speech is that thought is a form of communication that is closer to my essence. Again, when I'm speaking, when I'm literally speaking, I'm going outside of my essence to another, whereas when I am thinking, my thinking is more a communication within myself. Okay, I see the question. I'll come back to that in a moment. But again, the thinking here is a form of communication that, because it's more internal, the thinking is closer to who I really am. So let me just finish this thought and I'll come back to the question. So what I'm explaining is this. There is God speaking to creation, which is God going to some degree outside of himself. And again, I have to put everything that I say kind of in quotes, because the world is not truly outside of God. The world truly is one with God. But it's kind of a level of, the world sees itself as an other, and therefore God speaks to the world. And therefore we can understand that metaphor in the way that I speak to you. That means I'm going to an other, I'm going outside of myself as I speak to you. But then there is a form of communication called thought, where just like when I think, that level of communication is more internal, closer to my essence, so too when God thinks to creation, God is still communicating with creation, but now the level of communication is a higher form. It is closer to God's essence, meaning to say that the level of godly energy that is now being flowed into the world through the communication of thought, that is a higher form of divine energy than the energy that God puts into the world through speech. I'll come back to this in a second, but really what the punchline is this, that when God creates the world during the 6 days, that is God speaking to the world. When God continues to create the world on Shabbos, that is God thinking to the world. So in other words, the communication continues because, as I said earlier, without God communicating with the world, without God flowing the divine energy into the world simply could not exist. So God has to communicate with the world on Shabbos. However, what happens on Shabbos is that it's a higher form of communication. Higher in the sense that the form of communication is more internal. Being that it's more internal, there is less otherness and there is more of the oneness. So when God speaks to the world during the 6 days, the world is kind of at the level of an other, as in God speaking to the world. When God thinks to the world on Shabbos, what happens is the form of communication, the divine energy, is a higher level divine energy, which then translates into the world being lifted up out of that otherness, that 6 weekday otherness that creation has during the 6 days of the week, by virtue of God thinking to the world, of God flowing a higher level of divine energy, higher as in closer to God's essence. What that does is that it has an effect on creation, that creation is actually elevated out of the otherness of the 6 days into the higher level of Shabbos. Okay, so let me just quickly take a look at the question. The question was, it says God made heaven. Yes, of course, you know, I'm just saying that there's a lot of God speaking in the story. Of course, speaking translates into what we understand as making. But the fact that it keeps reminding us that God says, let there be, conveys the idea that ultimately the form of communication is what we refer to as the speech or the word of God within creation. By the way, let me just, before we continue, now, you know, Kabbalistic ideas are not that easy to understand, and certainly not that easy to convey. So you know, it's what we have to use human analogy, but with a caveat that whenever we use human analogy, we always have to realize that the human analogy breaks down. It's never a perfect analogy because, after all, we're human beings and God is God. So in the analogy of speech, you know, when I speak to you, the word that I now say to you is gone. It's like it's left me. I don't really control it anymore, which is why I have to be very careful what I say. You know, people, once they say something, whoops, I shouldn't have said it. Well, sorry, you can't take it back. So when I speak to you, my word leaves me and goes to you. Whereas when God speaks to the world, God is always, it's not like God said and now he's not in control anymore. So God speaking to the world, number one, creates as well as communicates, because the creation is the communication. The communication is the creation. And number two, God's speech is a constant connection with the world. It's not when I speak to you that once I've said it, I've lost that connection. So bottom line is that God continues to create the world on Shabbos. Clearly, like I said, it's just that the level of divine energy that is put into creation on Shabbos is what we call thought, in contrast to the speech of the 6 days. Now, this switch from speech mode, so to speak, to thought mode is what we refer to as God resting. Now, why is that called resting? What does it mean that God rested on the 7th day? And by the way, you know, when we say God created in 6 days and rested on the 7th, it's an ongoing cycle. It happens the whole time. It's a constant thing. God is creating 6 days at the level of speech, and every Shabbos, God then switches to that higher form of communication, which is thought. Now, why is that called rest? Why is that called relaxation? And the answer to that is because if you think about yourself, when you want to rest, okay, what does it mean you want to rest? You need to relax. So what happens is this. You're working. Let's say you work in an office. I know today, let's say your office is somewhere in your basement. Okay, wherever it is, you're out there in the world for whatever that means. And of course, you get tired. You know, you need to refresh. So what do? You withdraw from that environment and you come back home. You'll notice the word you are withdrawing. You are, in a sense, returning back to who you are. You come back home. You're at home. Let's say you're with your family, which is, of course, already coming back home. But sometimes you're so tired that you need to withdraw even further. You need to go to your room. And sometimes you're so tired that you need to go to sleep. But each level of resting is really withdrawal. To rest means like this. I'm engaging with an other, and then when I need to rest, I stop engaging with the other and I return back to myself. I return back home And of course, home translates into literal home, it translates into my room, and it translates also home to within myself, to the point that I don't want to have anything to do with anything out there, and I go to sleep. I completely withdraw into myself. So if you think about it, another way of defining rest is withdraw, to withdraw from something. That's what it means to rest. So now when we say that during the 6 days, God is operating at the level of speech, which is kind of, quote, external. There is an other to which God is speaking. And then on Shabbos, when God goes back to a higher level of communication, that is withdrawing. In other words, God is withdrawing from that speech mode and coming back closer to himself, back closer to his essence. He's continuing to communicate, but because the communication is at that higher, more internal level, it's therefore what we refer to as withdrawal, as with rest.
I have a question.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Going back to, you said something about like creativity, and even in your, like on Shabbat, you're not, there shouldn't be active creativity. Did I understand that? But in your thoughts, you could still be actively creative. Is that a violation then?
Well, it's as long as you're thinking good. Now that you're not thinking about your business on Shabbos, okay? But of course, your thoughts, you can't switch off your thoughts. I mean, this is, obviously it doesn't mean that on Shabbos we're supposed to just knock ourselves out. We'll soon see that the thinking of Shabbos as in holy thoughts is a form of withdrawal. I'll get there in a moment.
Okay.
So let's keep moving here. So bottom line then is that rest equals withdrawal, or rest equals return. Return back to your essence. Return back to who you really are. That's another way of explaining what Shabbos is. And once we understand that, what's fascinating is that the Hebrew word Shabbos is spelled Shin Bet Tov. And if you just rearrange those letters, it makes the word Tashev, which means to return. So you can see that within the word of Shabbos is spelled the same word that means return. So in other words, what this means then is that when we say that Shabbos is Shabbat Kodesh, is a day of holiness, what that means is that on Shabbos, there is a higher level of divine energy, of divine revelation that comes into the world. And that higher level of divine energy, revelation, elevates the world. The world becomes a holier world because God is flowing into the world a higher form, a higher level of divine energy. This is what we mean. This is what we mean by the holiness of Shabbos. And so when we talk then about us celebrating Shabbos, the idea of us tapping into the holiness of Shabbos. So bottom line is, Shabbos is an inherently holy day. Whether or not we make Shabbos, it's on the calendar, right? It's right there. Now the question is, how do we connect with this gift called Shabbos? How do we connect with the holiness of Shabbos? And the answer is because if we celebrate Shabbos the way the Torah tells us to, we are connecting with Shabbos. Because if you think about it, when we stop working on Shabbos, again, from that worldly creativity, the creativity of how I'm going to go out there and fix the world, when we to some degree withdraw from that on Shabbos, in a sense, we're coming back to ourselves, which of course translates also into family time. Yes, the reason why we are coming back from the world and back home and spending more time with the family is because that's what Shabbos is. Shabbos is that day of elevation. Elevation means back to yourself. Not so much going outside of yourself and communicating with another, but rather coming back to yourself, which means the closer you are to your essence, the closer you are to that core of who you are. And that's what we mean by the elevation of Shabbos. So that when you have this reunion of Shabbos, when you come back to your community, which is also coming back home to some degree, when you come back to your family, when you come back to yourself, you come back to your soul. which is why you take care of your soul on Shabbos more so than during the week, in the sense that during the week we're so busy running around. On Shabbos, we have the time to study some Torah and spend more time in prayer. What all of that does is that it all emphasizes the idea of return to the essence, tapping into the fact that this is a holy day. And when we return to our own essence, we then realize that the world around us is also a holier world. And this explains a phenomenal thing about Shabbos, if you think about it. On the one hand, we say that Shabbos is a day of intense holiness. Right here I am telling you that Shabbos is a day when the divine energy is at a much higher level, and the world is therefore elevated. The world is not so much a separate world. The world is not so much a world that is so self-centered. Somehow, because of the holiness of Shabbos, the world is given a higher sense, maybe a little bit of a higher sense of holiness and purpose. But here's the question. If Shabbos is a day of such holiness, why the emphasis on good food and wearing your best clothes and putting out your best dishes? I mean, how does that fit in with holiness? Usually when we think of holiness, we think of, kind of removing ourselves from the material, from the physical. So how does the intensity of the holiness of Shabbos translate into kugel and gefilte fish? Like, what's holy about that? Why is that the emphasis? And the answer is that this is precisely what is happening on Shabbos. You see, during the week, the material world is materialistic. It's being created by God, but the divine revelation within the world during the 6 days, because it is at a lower level of divine energy, therefore the world has less awareness of its divine source. And therefore the world, because it has less awareness of its divine source, the world is more materialistic and self-centered. And therefore materialism is not therefore conducive that easily to spirituality. And there's something of a struggle. You want to make physical spiritual. It's not that simple, because the physical says, wait, well, leave me alone. I'm physical, I'm material. What's this business about spirituality? Comes Shabbos, there is an inherent awareness within the world, within the physical, of its connection with God. And therefore the good food, which on Monday, it's not a mitzvah to have good, it's certainly a mitzvah to eat and be healthy, but the mitzvah to enjoy food is only on Shabbos. Why? Because on Shabbos, the physical material food and your nice clothes and your nice dishes and everything else that is so nice in a physical way is not a contradiction to the spirituality. It's in a way you could even say, if we use the word reunion, on Shabbos, it's a reunion of the Creator with his creation. During the 6 days of the week, there's some kind of almost distance between creation and creator. Creation doesn't necessarily recognize its creator. Comes Shabbos, that's the ultimate reunion of God and his world. And that's one of the reasons why on Shabbos, you'll notice the Friday night prayer is we talk about the Shabbos bride, the reunion of the groom and the bride, the reunion of God and his world. Boi chala, come my bride. It's this reunion. It's this idea of during the 6 days, there's a certain distance that somehow comes about. Shabbos is the day to bring everything back home. Creation with its creator and us with our communities and our friends and our families and ourselves. And Shabbos, therefore, is that day that really sets the focus, because then what happens is once on Shabbos, we have sort of recalibrated, we've refocused as to what this is really all about, that ultimately this is God's world. Then with that energy of Shabbos, we actually then go into the week that follows. We often think of Shabbos as coming at the end of the week. And it's true. The 6 days that build up to Shabbos. There's no question that Shabbos is definitely the climax of the week. But at the same time, Shabbos isn't just the end of a week. Shabbos is also the day that blesses the week that follows. And it's precisely because Shabbos empowers us with this message of holiness and sanctity and the fact that the world truly is one with God. And that is our mission now, to go back into that weekday world, the 6 days of the week, and see if we can bring that message of Shabbos into the week as well. One of the miracles were in the Torah portions now that talk about our patriarchs and our matriarchs. So one of the miracles that happened with our matriarchs is the miracle of the Shabbos candles. It says that when they would light Shabbos candles on Friday, the miracle was that these Shabbos candles, these Shabbos lights would burn throughout the week. Now that's, you know, what is that, just like a fancy Hanukkah miracle every week? No, it really conveys an idea that the holiness of Shabbos is to be brought into the rest of the week as well. And by the way, this also explains why Shabbos begins with a mitzvah of candlelighting, because Shabbos is a day of light. What do we mean by a day of light? Light is clarity. If you're in a room that's pitch black, you know, you can find your way, but you're going to bump into things. There's a lack of clarity. And then the light is switched on. What happens when the light is switched on? Then you see, here's the table, here's the chair, here's the wall, here's the door. You see the truth. So too, during the 6 days of the week, we're so busy running around and verschwitzt that sometimes we forget that reality. Comes Shabbos and says, wait a minute, switch on the light here, meaning to say, turn on that light of clarity that the world is created by God, and God is constantly connecting with the world, and God is creating the world for a purpose, and we are very much part of that purpose. And it again gives us that clarity as to what this is really all about. And so since Shabbos is a day of light, it's definitely therefore appropriate that that light is literally translates into more light in the home, which is the mitzvah of Shabbos candles. And you'll notice a fascinating thing about the Shabbos candles is that typically when we begin Shabbos, so there are usually 2 candles that are lit, sometimes more. You know, there are customs about candle lighting. Some people light one for each child in the family in addition to the 2. But at any rate, if you start with the 2 lights before Shabbos, at the end of Shabbos, we also have a candle. But the Havdalah candle is actually at least 2 wicks that are together. In other words, what Shabbos does is Shabbos unifies, where at the beginning of Shabbos, things seem to be still separate. It's still like we're absorbing the beginning of Shabbos, but we're dealing with a 6-day week. As a result of Shabbos, by the time we come to the end of Shabbos, anything that seemed to be divided is now become one. So that the 2 candles of Shabbos are actually united into one candle as Shabbos ends.
I hate to say, but we have to start wrapping up because there's a tight schedule today.
Okay, so I'll just wrap up very quickly and just bring it back to the kugel, my friends. It's the fact that kugel, it's a mitzvah to eat gefilte fish and kugel and whatever else your traditional Shabbos dishes. Let me just add that it actually tastes a lot better on Shabbos. You'll notice the same kugel during the week doesn't taste as good. In fact, the Talmud tells us this is a quick story of someone who was invited to the rabbi's house. Is actually the governor. This goes back to Talmudic times, and the food was delicious. And he asked for the recipe. So the rabbi's cook sent the recipe to the governor's cook. The cook followed instructions, but it didn't taste the same. The governor was mad. He said, wait a minute, you didn't give the proper recipe because it doesn't taste the same. So the rabbi responded, we gave you the exact recipe, but there's one piece that's missing, and that is Shabbos, the special spice called Shabbos. But now we understand that the holiness of Shabbos translates into the physical because Shabbos is the reunion of creation with its creator. And so it's actually felt all the way into the food. Okay, so I guess if there are any final questions, but let me just add one more thing. I mean, if we're already talking about Shabbos candles, there was a fascinating incident that took place just before the year 2000. I don't know if you heard of this, but the New York Times put out a futuristic edition in honor of Y2K, year 2000. So they put out an imaginary front page of the New York Times from the year 2100, like 100 years in advance. So they had stories about robots, about this, about that, all these futuristic things. But at the bottom of the page, they had this little notice, women and girls light Shabbos candles 18 minutes before sunset. And so the editor, people asked the editor, like, why is that in the edition of the year 2100? So the editor said, it's interesting. It wasn't a Jewish person. He said like this, we were thinking what to put on the front page. What this will be, what that'll be, there were all kinds of guesses. But one thing we knew for sure, that if Jewish women and girls have been lighting Shabbos candles for thousands of years, we know that 100 years from now, they will still be lighting Shabbos candles. And you can look it up on that front page of that futuristic New York Times edition. At the bottom, you will see women and girls, light Shabbos candles, because Shabbos has that eternal message. And it has that eternal message because really Shabbos is that focus of who we are, why we're here. We are really here to bring about that reunion of creation and its creator. And that's why when Mashiach comes and the world will be perfect, it's referred to as a Shabbos world. Liyom shekulo Shabbat. We pray for that day, for the world when it'll be all Shabbos, which means not that we're going to be making Kiddush every day, but it just means that the world will be filled with that awareness of God, that is really what Shabbos is. Shabbos is that glimpse into the future. And of course, we hope that perfect future will happen very, very soon. So I want to wish you all a good Shabbos. And now that you know a little bit more, tap into the Shabbos and really feel and absorb that higher divine energy that we're all receiving on Shabbos.
Rabbi Vogel, thank you so